Good afternoon. It's Reverend Will and Reverend Christy coming back with another weekly devotion. And let us start our time together with a prayer by Bo Lozoff, who's the co-founder and director of the Human Kindness Foundation and the award-winning Prison Ashram Project. It's called Seeking Truth. I am a seeker of truth on a spiritual journey. I believe life has sacred meaning and purpose. May my behavior today express my deepest beliefs. May I approach each and every task today with quiet impeccability. May I be a simple, humble, kind presence on the earth today. May I see the divine nature in all beings today. May I be grateful today to those who came before me, and may I make the road smoother for those who will travel after me. May I leave each place at least a little better than I found it today. May I truly cherish this day, knowing that it may be my last. May I remember, not to forget. Amen.
Amen.
Good intentions for us today, especially we're going to talk a little bit about a response to a couple images that I shared during my message on Sunday for our Earth Day sermon. And why don't you, I'll share the screen, and why don't you share a little bit of your response when you first saw these images?
Okay. So my response was initially to the image that is on the right of my screen. You have the word ego and nature, and then two circles underneath it. And when I first saw these images, something in me just really resonated with them. And I think there's a way in which, as we are sheltering in place and being alone and there's more solitude, and we're kind of beginning to see how people are responding to the virus and understanding our place in the world, there was something about these two images that feels like it reveals a truth on some level. And my sense is that the first image, which has ego on the top and the image of the human being in the midst of the circle, is a way to understand how many of us live, as if we are the center of the universe, and as a culture, how we live, as if we are the center and the rest of the world is there to, I mean, in some ways, just to frank language, to be exploited by us to meet our needs.
Like a utilitarian worldview.
Exactly.
That sees everything as a resource for us.
Exactly. And that whole me, I, the sense that we are the center of the universe. We as human beings have claimed that, and really, as a result of that, have abused the rest of creation. And that the call, I think, is to the second image, which is on the right under nature, which is that we really are part of this incredible circle of life. And that if we are to come out of this time of isolation into a transformed view of the world, I think this is what it would be, that we are no longer the center, but actually a part of a larger whole. And that from that place we respect the other beings in the natural world and see them as having a certain value in and of themselves, as opposed to value just in relationship to serving and fulfilling our needs.
One of the things I was thinking of sharing and didn't share Sunday was that I heard recently that the scientists are now counting that we've already had 6 great extinctions, and they just added a new one just before the Permian mass extinction. And so scholars have been saying for some time that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction on the planet right now, and that this is the first one that's human induced.
Oh,
Wh-
interesting.
Whereas now it's being counted as the seventh mass extinction because of this additional one that got counted that had somehow gotten swept up with the Permian one and is now recognized as a distinct extinction event. But we're actually seeing extinction of other animals and their loss of habitat as the main reason, faster than even during the Permian, which was one of the fastest mass extinctions in the history of our planet. Which means that we're not allowing other relations, and I really love that term Philip Scott uses and Native Americans use of reminding us that there are relatives and they're the four-legged ones and the flying ones while we're the two-legged ones, and that there are certain gifts that each species has and gives to the greater community of species and life on the planet. But when one species gets out of balance with the rest, and we don't even allow for the space of other species to exist, that it puts their life and their ability to survive at risk as well. And for us as conscious beings, the question is how much of this is ego or hyper individualism, which is the other kind of aspect of our culture, versus how do we let that ego go, right? Remove the E and let it go, which is kind of a fascinating thing. But it really is whether or not we allow ourselves to be relations and relatives to the other creatures. And it's really what's so sad right now is watching so many of our systems just keep going on this trajectory, using up every last portion of the earth for human food or food for our farmed animals, rather than allowing for the wild animals to have space.
Right. And allowing for us as humans to relate to the animals and the plants in a different way. And there's actually a quote that it's just one sentence actually, but it struck me in relationship to this, that we as humans have in some ways disowned our connection to the natural world. And this is a quote from David Abram, The Spell of the Sensuous. It's the name of the book. But at the very beginning, this is what he writes. He writes, humans are tuned for relationship. The eyes, the skin, the tongue, the ears, the nostrils, all are gateways where our body receives the nourishment of otherness. And just the sense that if we were to reclaim literally our human body as a way to relate to animals, to plants, and to realize that our soul is nourished when we are open to these other beings and these other ways that the universe is manifesting around us, that we've actually cut ourselves off from our own spiritual health in some ways. We've sacrificed our own being in putting the ego first. And so this image of letting the ego go so that the ego is released, and then claiming this relatedness, that literally our skin, our eyes, our nose, we are physically made to be in relationship with all these other creatures and beings.
I think it was E.O. Wilson who had a great description of early human evolution and how central the campfire was to our evolution into consciousness, and that if it weren't for the campfire to be able to keep wild animals at bay and be able to start to cook some of the things that we were eating, that we would not have been able to have created we wouldn't have evolved towards consciousness as fast as we did because we were communitarian beings, and that it was in the community and the transfer of information about how to survive in a wild world that you could transfer from generation to generation and start to care for more at-risk individuals in your tribe, to help them live longer and long enough to be able to be holders of that wisdom, to be able to teach the younger children that became the basis of human culture. And that if we hadn't had that over the last 6 million years, we we might not have evolved towards the consciousness that we have today, but the vestiges of that tribalism that helped us survive is now no longer serving us as it did to protect us in our clan around a campfire from either wild beasts or other clans. Now we have to unlearn that tribalism if we want to survive.
And
Because
reclaim this
because we've taken over the world.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And cut ourselves off in order to stay safe and protect ourselves. And yet what we've cut ourselves off from at this point actually has the capacity to nurture us. And so what you're saying is that we've moved to an extreme on the spectrum, and now we have to open and move back into a relatedness and a connectedness.
Yeah, tribalism served us well for 6 million years to get us to this place, but it's not serving us anymore because now we need to learn how to cooperate rather than compete for resources if we're going to make a real change. And a part of that change probably has to come with a change of worldview to our relatedness and our cooperation rather than our competitiveness and our alienation from one another.
Exactly. Not only from one another, but from the world, from the beings in the world.
The rest of the natural world.
Yeah, yeah. And so the challenge is to unlearn and then relearn and to honor the past. I mean, I think that's the other thing, to honor that tribalism played its role and had a certain power within a certain time frame. And now things have shifted and other skills and other ways of relatedness are now necessary. And to really be able to embrace that.
We got a letter from one of our neighbors here in Benicia that was dropped off in our mailbox yesterday. And it was just folks on our street. I think they shared a checklist of things that people could check if they needed help or if they wanted to connect or not, and an email address with one of our neighbors that was reaching out to try to make sure that everyone had enough food, that people weren't overly isolated, if they needed to be able to talk to someone and offer to have a FaceTime conversation or a telephone conversation. And so what's interesting is that while it's easy for us, and many of our neighborhoods are built in order to allow us to have our own little home safe zone and even watch TV and see movies and do all of the things that we normally used to have to do outside, inside of our own home, and to let that be the cocoon that protects us from the outside world. Now, even in the midst of COVID-19, now's the time we actually need our neighbors more than any other time, especially if you are one that are at risk of catching the infection and need help getting groceries, or if you're feeling isolated and living alone and don't have other folks helping. Now's the time when we need to create more local community in order to be able to survive this time well together.
Yeah. So that isolation is actually breeding community, which is such a paradox and such a beautiful thing. And that sufficiency is no longer possible. I mean, we can't, in isolation, meet all of our needs. I mean, we have physical needs, spiritual needs, emotional needs. I mean, we need to have others to interact with and to support us and to engage with. And yeah. So it's already happening. I think this shift away from isolationism, which again, paradoxically, it was easier to be isolated and self-sufficient before we went into sheltering in place. And now that we're actually forced to be isolated, we actually are learning the power of connection.
I heard from a colleague on a Zoom call this morning how hard it was for her as a pastor to be the caregiver of her own family, let alone her congregation, and how she was kind of in a low place and feeling depressed. And that's the other part of it too, is even in the alienation, it's easy to sometimes feel as if you have to be constantly giving rather than being able to take some time for yourself with all of the different meetings that are going on and all of the conversations where we're trying to keep our community going and alive. and helping others find the community so necessary to survive, and even making phone calls yesterday to some of our congregants and reminding them that there are some resources with the county if they are going through a hard time, and that it's okay to even ask for help because this is an emergency for all of us. And while some folks may have all of the ability to be able to care for themselves, or they have enough food and other products on hand to be able to survive, some folks don't, and this is going to be very difficult and for a lot of folks financially. And how do we support one another during this time as well is the other piece of that. How do we transform our relatedness into caring for one another and making sure that everyone's going to survive this together is very important.
It's really true. Yeah, yeah. And
But being willing to be honest about your current state, even your state of mind.
yeah, and then being able to share that. And trusting that there will be people who will be able to respond to that. And that's part, again, of the gift of community, that there's this reciprocity that if you're in the circle of relatedness, then sometimes you're the one who receives the care, sometimes you're the one who gives the care, and that it's not always on you, again, in the center of that. Talking about the other image from the very beginning, where in the center of the circle, the human being is totally responsible for everything. I mean, now there's a sense of being able to release some of that and to really understand that we are in this web of interconnection. And there's a give and a take, a receiving and a giving. And that I think ideally, as people of faith, we trust that that's supported by unconditional love, and that finally the strength that nourishes all of us is this sacred love that comes to us and heals and strengthens and grants us courage.
But that takes radical truthfulness. We have to be willing to be truthful about our own weaknesses, even if they're momentary, our own needs, and even taking an inventory of those times when we feel like we have all of our needs met, knowing what resources we have to give others during their time, whether that's their time of struggle, whether it's an individual taking time on a telephone call with someone or listening to what they're going through. However we need to divvy up those resources for when the times when we can be there for someone else, but also recognizing and knowing where we can go when we need help ourselves.
Exactly. And that there are resources. I mean, there are reservoirs of grace, so to speak, that there is, again, I think this sense of we have exploited resources to sustain ourselves in a way that I think that there's a way that we can rethink that and understand that there are spiritual resources, there are physical resources, and that we have access to them and we need to share them and understand how intricately we are all interconnected and affect each other.
Yeah, whether that's what we do with our plastic refuse or how we respond to what's going on with the Great Barrier Reef, which is interconnected with the amount of carbon and the acidification of the oceans, which is interconnected with the amount of overfishing and everything else that we're doing in the oceans as well.
Yeah. So that hopefully we as humans are invited into this place now, I think, where we can see things differently. And really
So this Sunday, I remember we met yesterday to talk about where your sermon is going on Sunday about abundance.
yeah,
Thinking in these terms about abundance can also help us recognize the resources and the relationship resources that we have as a part of that abundance as well.
exactly. Yeah. And that's where Sunday will take us.
So, Thomas Aquinas said if you make a mistake about creation, you're going to make a mistake about God. If the way we view the world and even the way we view human nature is mistaken, we're going to make a mistake about the very nature of God as well. So if we view ourselves as inherently autonomous and not in relationship or not in need of other people, that's going to create a different view that we might have of the way we describe the divine, and might actually make it more difficult to have a relationship with a fully gracious, fully welcoming, fully abundant, providing presence of the divine in our lives.
And incarnate presence.
Incarnate as well, and fleshed, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. Incarnate not only in humans, but again in the animals and the plants. And this sense that the divine is always available and always surrounds us and manifests in all these different ways.
I want to share this image one more time and just hear more from you about how we can change the way we view the world. But even just the invitation of this image for you.
Yeah, I think that it really has to do with everything that we've said, that when the ego is the center and when self-preservation and self-sufficiency defines who we are disconnected, not only from the larger world, but really disconnected from our own heart and bodies. And so I think that the call now is to, if you realize that, to see that, and to embrace this second way of this second image where we see that we are part of this larger whole, and that we're related to this larger whole. And because of that, we aren't self-sufficient. I mean, being self-sufficient is an illusion. It's not true. It's not true. And yet we believe it to be true when the ego is at the center. So to move into this, I think, greater truth, which is the truth that our spirits, our hearts, our bodies need other humans, need the larger world, need the animals, the plants, and that is a truer way for us to actually live out a fully human life.
And we need them not just for resources or the resources of that they create for us, but to be in relationship with them. Maybe even recognizing the spark of the divine in them.
Exactly. Which is part of, I think, the gift of our spiritual tradition, that we are all created beings, and that the sense of incarnation, that the spirit, the divine, is alive within us and around us, within us. Yeah, it's very powerful.
And finite beings, and becoming okay with being a finite being rather than immortal.
It's tricky, but yeah, and that's part of the challenge. I think that these things are not easy necessarily. It's to look at our vulnerability and our mortality is hard and challenging, anxiety producing and fear producing for some folks, especially now when COVID-19 is pressing in on families and individuals and communities. To acknowledge our vulnerability is extremely important and yet difficult. And I think that, again, our faith brings us these resources that even as we face into our mortality, that there is the promise of Easter that gives us to be present and incarnate.
And even a celebration of the value of life as we watch suffering around the world.
Yeah, and how precious life is. And a gift that it is. Yeah.
That's Easter and Eastertide, living into all of that at the same time, right?
Yeah. Which is, again, gift and challenge, I think, to embrace this truth of the beauty and the power of life beyond death and through death. But it is what we're called to do.
Definitely. Well, thanks for this time again. We'll do another devotion next week, and we just had our Wednesday social hour, so I'm looking forward to Sunday and your message on living with abundance. Thank you.
Okay. See you Sunday.
Take care.